Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the invitation for giving this online lecture here today. It would have been nice to have been able to give the presentation in person, but unfortunately, that's just how things are right now. So yeah, today I'm going to be presenting some work that we've done partly in the course of my PhD, partly some colleagues of mine over the last couple of years at KU Leuven, and it's all about simulating kinetic equations, which are diffusively scaled, and I'll get to what that means in a moment, using asymptotic-preserving schemes combined with multi-level Monte Carlo particle methods. So there's a lot of different parts there, but we'll get to them one by one. Before I start, I'd just like to mention my collaborators. So we have Bert Mostier, a fellow PhD student at KU Leuven, and then my two PhD supervisors, Giovanni Samai and Stefan van der Wal. So with that, let's just get right in, make sure that we're all familiar with where we're working. So we're interested in kinetic equations, and what's the idea there? Well, the general problem we look at is an ensemble of particles. So we have a set of particles moving in some space somewhere, and we can model this in a number of different ways. So you could zoom in very, very, very fine and look at individual particles, and then you in the finest level you end up with so-called reversible models, where you model individual interactions. You know which particles interact with each other, which collisions they undergo, and then you end up with some paths which could look something like this if you want to plot them. Obviously, this very fine method is not going to work very well in practice once you have a large number of particles, and also once the particles start to have very many collisions with each other, it becomes impossible to compute this kind of model. So then you look at simplifications, and then if you look at all the way in the other extreme, you can simplify looking at driving the particle density up so far that you can't really tell different particles apart from each other anymore. And then we can use a fluid type approach. So you could consider stuff like simulating Euler equations, simulating with Navier-Stokes, where you have PDEs, which describe some kinds of moments of the particle distribution. This can be density, for example. It can be some kind of energy quantity of the particle's flux. And typically these take the form of then conservation laws, which we simulate, and you do this on a grid. So you can use something like finite element, or you can use finite volume methods, whatever your favorite type of method is. Now we're interested in looking at something in between here, because the problem with these models is we only get information about some very specific moments, and we don't capture all of the particle dynamics in terms of how they're moving as well as to where they are. So what we want to do is compute the total probability density function of particles in space. And at each position in space, we also want to know their distribution in terms of their velocity. So that's what we're interested in. And that's where these kinetic equations come in. So the typical equation that we have in this setting is the Boltzmann equation, which then models this distribution function f. So why are we specifically interested in these models? Well, we have some colleagues at the Department of Mechanical Engineering here at KU Leuven who are specifically looking at tokamak nuclear fusion reactors. These reactors have been a bit of a big topic over the last couple of years. You see them coming back again and again at conferences. But the general idea is that you have some machine or a reactor which looks like this. It's a toroidally shaped device. It contains a plasma moving around in it, and then in this plasma, ions combine to create energy. Now, clearly, this is incredibly difficult to build, also quite expensive, so we can't really test new components in real life, but we can use numerical simulation, of course. And then we look at how can we do this. Well, on the one hand, we have this plasma, which I mentioned. This plasma is a dense set of electromagnetically charged particles, which are controlled by an electromagnetic field. They're dense enough that typically this fluid approximation I mentioned is used to model them. But there's a second class of particles which are injected into this plasma as a way of control, and these are neutral particles. So we use neutral particles to control the plasma because they don't get influenced by this electromagnetic field contained in the plasma. They're used, for example, to control the temperature of the plasma. And these have a much lower density. So they don't really react with each other, but what they do is collide with the background plasma at quite a high frequency or quite high collision rates. And this is where these kinetic equations come in. So the actual application we were interested in is a coupled system of, on the one hand, fluid equations and kinetic equations, which then have to be simulated together. But for this talk, we're going to just zoom in and focus on these kinetic equations here. Final note on these kinetic equations is that they're high dimensional in general, in the sense that because we model both position and velocity distribution of the particles, a 3D simulation ends up with a 7D model. And hence the best way to simulate these is using Monte Carlo particle methods. So now we can dive right in after we've motivated why we're doing this with the actual mathematics. So we have this position, velocity, phase space. At each moment in time, a particle is completely defined by its position x and its velocity v. And then the distribution f follows a kinetic equation, which in our case, we're going to describe like this. So it's what we see here. We see that the distribution of particles changes in time. We see there's some transport, so particles move with the velocity they have at that moment in time. And then we have this abstract collision operator here, q, which is going to cause discontinuous changes in the velocity of particles, which then influences how they move with the transport term. Now, this q is abstract for the moment, but in our case, what we're typically going to use is the so-called BGK collision operator, which looks like this. What have I put here? Well, what we do is we look at the density of particles. At a given position, we remove particles proportional to the number of particles that have a given velocity. So if there's lots of fast particles, we remove more fast particles than slow particles. And we take them all out of the simulation and we throw them into a big pot. And we then reintroduce them at the same position, this is where the density rho comes in, but using the distribution m for their new velocity. And this is their post-collisional velocity, which we then reintroduce them into this simulation with. So what's going to happen is gradually we're going to drive these particles to this m, this Maxwellian equilibrium distribution. Okay, so that's the model itself. Now, what we are interested in doing is looking at what happens when we drive the number of collisions very high. So we're looking at almost infinite number of collisions per unit time, but not fully infinite. So we're looking close to this infinite collision limit. To quantify this in some way, we're going to add a collision rate to the right-hand side of the equation. We're going to do that by adding this term 1 over epsilon here. So as epsilon goes to 0, the time between collisions goes to 0, and thus the collision rate goes to infinity. And we're also at the same time going to rescale time. And conceptually, why do we do this? Well, you can imagine a particle which is undergoing many, many collisions in a small amount of time. It's just going to keep changing direction. And it's not going to go anywhere. So you're not going to see net drift effects, for example, from the sum of all these collisions, unless you look at long time horizons. And for that reason, we rescale time. So this gives us a so-called diffusively scaled kinetic equation. And this is the actual model that we're interested in simulating in our setting. Why it's called diffusively scaled will become apparent in a moment. But the final thing I'm now going to do is divide the whole thing by epsilon, giving us this. And this is going to be the model we are simulating. Okay, so this is at the PDE level. We have PDE for the distribution of particles. At the individual particle level, what happens? Well, we have a velocity jump process. So that means that particles move in a straight line with a given velocity at a certain moment in time t, until they have a collision with another particle. The time between collisions is exponentially distributed with expected time between collisions than epsilon squared, the same epsilon squared we have here. If there is a collision, we resample the velocity from the distribution m, and then the particle just moves in a straight line again. So it's a very simple process. Now, both of these two have a nice limit when we drive epsilon to 0. So at the PDE level, this model here, if we look at it in terms of particle density, we get convergence to the diffusion equation. And this is why this is called diffusive scaling of the PDE, of the kinetic equation. At the particle level, all of these collisions, as we drive the time between collisions to zero, we have an infinite number of changes in direction. And this happens to converge to Brownian motion. So that's what we have right here. And this should not be a surprise for most people, because there is this inherent link between the diffusion equation on the one hand and Brownian motion at the fine level. Okay, so now the question is, how do we go about simulating this? Well, one approach you can take is to apply operator splitting. And what does that mean? Well, here we have our kinetic equation, and we're going to just split it in two. So first, we're going to look at the transport effects. And then we're going to independently look at collision effects. In doing so, we make we introduce a linear bias into what we compute, but we're also going to be using linear time-stepping methods anyways. So in fact, this doesn't cause the error to scale in any different way than before. Now, the transport step is straightforward to simulate. We have a velocity, we have a position, and we just do a forward step to get a new particle position. And then at the end of the transport step, we have to decide, was there a collision, was there not a collision? We can calculate the probability of these two cases happening. And then we know with a given probability, we either decide to resample the velocity from this distribution, or we just keep the velocity from before and go into the next time step where we again do a forward step. So this is a very simple scheme to use in this case. But obviously, we haven't solved the problem. We still have a lot to talk about. And why is that? Well, here you see this 1 over epsilon term. And we're interested in looking at what happens when epsilon becomes small, when we have lots of collisions for a finite amount of time. To keep this whole process stable, we're going to have to take smaller and smaller time steps as epsilon decreases. So we have a time step restriction. As epsilon gets very small, this becomes very expensive. So now the rest of this talk is then going to be about how we use a combination of asymptotic-preserving particle schemes on the one hand and multi-level Monte Carlo to avoid this issue of this time step restriction. So first I'm going to introduce these two approaches very quickly. Then I am going to say how we do this in practice for the scheme I just showed you, how we apply asymptotic-preserving multi-level Monte Carlo here. Then present some simulation results on in this area, and finally present some current and future developments that I both planned here and also with some work of colleagues of mine. So first off, the asymptotic-preserving schemes. Now, the idea is the following. What we're going to do is substitute this original model, this is the same equation I showed you before, with a new equation. Now, this equation comes from a derivation which can be found in this paper. I'm not going to go into detail, but I am going to say what each of these terms mean. So what we've actually done is substituted this equation with an equation which now explicitly contains the model time step on the one hand and has an extra term in it. This extra term is a diffusion term, and I already mentioned, we know that as epsilon gets very small in this case, we converge to diffusion. So what we've done is explicitly included this information into our new model. Now let's see what happens if we look at the limits for the time step. Let's say we take a very large time step where we had the stability issue in the past. Well, you can look at this term, delta t going to infinity, the fraction becomes 0, so this term disappears. The same thing happens here, and you're left with this thing going to 1, and you have then the diffusion equation. So the diffusion equation can be simulated with any time step you want. It's stable no matter what you do. So we can take large time steps in a stable way, but we just simulate a different model. The model gives us a good estimate of what we want, but it's not as accurate as simulating this kinetic equation here. If we take the time step very, very small, so let's just fill in 0 in these fractions, well, and this thing here converges to v over epsilon, the same v over epsilon we have here. This thing here becomes 1 over epsilon squared, the same one we have here, and this term disappears. So we have convergence to the original model. So what you can how you can think of this scheme is a kind of linear combination between, on the one hand, the limiting model, which is the diffusion equation in our case, and on the other hand, the exact kinetic equation that we want to simulate. And depending on the time step we simulate with, we are closer to one limit or the other limit. And the diffusion equation will be stable with large time steps, but have a large bias. There will be 0 bias if the time step is very small, but then it's expensive. And this is where we're going to later have multi-level Monte Carlo. So first off, I'm just going to show you how an operator splitting scheme would look like in this case. So it's just what I showed you before. First, we do a transport step with the velocity and the position. The fraction here is a little bit different. And now we also have some Brownian motion because of this diffusion term that's new. And at the end of each time step, again, we have a probability of collision and a probability of no collision. And based on that, we either keep the old velocity or we don't. So the new thing is we have to generate an extra normally distributed increment here. That's not a big problem. And if we look here, where we had this 1 over epsilon before that blew up, we now have something that remains finite for all epsilon. Okay, so this scheme can take large time steps in a stable way, but compute the wrong result. And then we can take fine time steps to get an accurate result. And this is where multi-level Monte Carlo comes in. So I'm assuming for most people listening today, multi-level Monte Carlo is not a new concept, but I'm going to briefly present 2 slides on it anyways, mostly to make sure that we're all familiar with the notation I'm using today. So let's say we have a Monte Carlo estimator of some quantity of interest y at time t star. And we can, in this case, state that it's the expected value of some function f of the particle position x at this time t star. Now, given we have a particle scheme, what we can do is just take p particles, simulate them until time t star with our time stepping method, and then apply the function to each one at a time and average over the results. This gives us a classical Monte Carlo estimator. Obviously, we have an error when we do this. So on the one hand, there's a systematic error due to the fact that there is a fixed time step, a time stepping scheme. The smaller this time step is, the more accurate each trajectory that we simulate is, but the more expensive it becomes. The larger the time step, the cheaper the simulation for an individual trajectory, but the larger the bias. And then on the other hand, we also have a statistical error, and that scales with the number of trajectories that we can simulate. So the more trajectories we have, the less noise there is on the output, the more certain our output is. And that gives us the so-called bias variance trade-off or fixed cost trade-off. And the question is, if we have a certain computational budget, how many samples do we take? So how many trajectories do we simulate? Do we do lots of cheap ones or very few expensive ones? Now, and then in the multi-level, the answer is that in multi-level Monte Carlo, you don't have to make this choice explicitly. So instead, we do a number of samples with a very coarse simulation. This P0, the number of particles, is very large because the simulations are very cheap. And because this P0 is so large, the bias of the result, although large, is going to be reliable. So if we repeat this multiple times, we're always going to have an equally large bias, or the same bias in our result. Because of this, we now just have to estimate what this bias could be in some way. And we do that by performing correlated simulations of particles. So what do I mean by that? On the one hand, we simulate a path with a fine set of small fine time steps. Then we try to simulate the same path with large time steps. And assuming that we achieve this goal very well of simulating the same path in both cases, and assuming that the fine simulation is more accurate than the coarse one, we can assume that this will give us an estimate of the bias of simulating with the larger time steps. Now we repeat this process many times over PL pairs of particles, and we get an estimator for the bias of this thing here. Repeat this over many levels L, and we get a multi-level estimator when we sum all of these y hats. And then you can show under certain conditions, mainly that this sum becomes converges in some way, the terms become smaller, that we have convergence, and we have a multi-level estimator that looks like this. Okay, so to use multi-level Monte Carlo, we have to find some way to simulate the same qualitative path of particles using two different time steps. And that's what I'm going to now go into here. So on this slide, there's quite a lot of symbols here, but what I've essentially done is, on the one hand, shown a course process here. This is going to span a given interval of time, delta t L minus 1, with a single course step. On the other hand, we have a fine process, which is spanning the same interval of time with m, capital M, fine time steps delta TL. So basically delta TL minus 1 equals m times delta TL. And then if we want to generate correlated paths, we go to work as follows. So first, we simulate our m fine time steps. Along the way, we generate truly random numbers. So we have the velocities at each time step. We have the size from the diffusion at each time step. And then also we have this decision of whether or not we had a collision in each of these fine steps. Based on the information from all these random numbers we've saved along the way, we generate from these m sets of random numbers, one set of random numbers for the course simulation by combining them in some way. And if we do that in a clever way, then we'll be able to make sure that this follows the same qualitative path as this. Now, as I already mentioned, what we're trying to do is simulate, on the one hand, things with very large time steps here, where the diffusion is going to be the most important term. So delta t going L minus 1 being very large, this term is going to be almost insignificant. Well, we're mostly going to be simulating Brownian motion in this very coarse simulation. If this is a very fine simulation, then we're mostly going to have these V's here. So we're going to have this velocity jump process, and this is going to be quite small. So if we want these two paths to have a similar shape, we're going to have to make sure that when we generate this coarse psi, we use not only information from the fine psi's, but also the fine velocities here. So that's the green arrows there. And then we're also going to have to make sure that the velocity going into the next course time step is matching the velocity of the fine simulation going into that next time step. So we're going to have to use some information to perform a correlation like this. Okay. So first I'm going to now discuss how we achieve the green arrows. And then I'm going to mention the orange arrows, or orange arrow as well. So the green arrows, I already mentioned, we have this coarse psi, and it's a combination on the one hand of something coming from fine diffusion and something coming from fine velocity terms. Now, if we can somehow ensure that this has mean 0 and variance 1, and this has mean 0 and variance 1, then we know that this will also have mean 0 and variance 1, assuming we define some theta here, which is between 0 and 1. So how do we achieve that? Well, this diffusion, we have a number of Brownian increments, psi, and the sum of Gaussians is still Gaussian, so we can just sum them and then rescale them to achieve the correct variance. So here we have a normally distributed value with the correct mean and variance. In terms of the velocities, if we assume that these things have mean 0 and variance 1, or at least have mean 0, we can apply the same principle. The expression for the rescaling becomes a bit more expensive or a bit more complicated because of the fact that following velocities may be correlated, because there's not always a collision in each time step. But the process is the same. We have an analytical expression for this, which you can find in this paper here. And again, we have something with mean 0 and variance 1. If if the velocities are Gaussian, then it will also be Gaussian. If the velocities are not Gaussian, then the only thing we know is that it has mean zero and variance 1. And then this will follow so-called weak Brownian motion. Now, in general, this will be good enough. If we have a smooth quantity of interest, weak Brownian motion, as shown in literature, will behave basically the same as strong Brownian motion, where we have true normally distributed increments. But for example, if we have discontinuities in the quantity of interest, we have to fix something here. So that's where some caveats come in. Weak Brownian motion and Brownian motion are not the same. And the issue is going to come in the fact that we don't have consistency on our telescopic sum. So the coarse diffusion in the finer level and then the fine diffusion in the previous level are no longer going to be distributed in the same way, meaning that we're potentially introducing this inconsistency. For Gaussian velocities, everything is fine, but for others, we have to change this level, this level L-1 fine simulation. We have an algorithm to do that in a paper which is soon to be appearing on arXiv. I'm not going to go into all the details on exactly how we achieve it here, because I think it's going to be a bit much to put in a presentation. But the point is that it is possible, given you put some work into it and do a bit of fiddly coding to do it. Okay, so that was for the two green arrows to generate the coarse diffusion. And I mentioned that we also have to make sure the velocities match at the end of the coarse time step. So how do we do that? Well, first we have to decide if there is a collision in the coarse simulation or not. And the easiest way to think about that is to think about how would we simulate this fine process? How would we decide in each time step, is there a collision or is there not a collision? Well, given that we know what the probability is of there being no collision, it's this fraction here, at each time step, we can generate a random uniformly distributed U between 0 and 1. If this U is larger than the threshold, then there is a collision in the fine process at that time step. Now, if one of these U's is large enough to generate a collision in the fine process, we also want there to be a good probability of there being a collision in the coarse process. So, well, we just take the largest U, the maximum, and then we can plug this into the coarse process. But we have to do one more small thing, and that's to take the mth power. And why is that? Well, the maximum of m uniformly distributed numbers is not uniformly distributed, but its mth power is. And if we do that, then with high probability, if there's a collision in the fine simulation, there will also be one in the coarse simulation. If there's a collision in both, then we just simply take the last velocity that we generated in the fine process to generate a velocity in the coarse process. So that's basically it. And then we know that at the end of the coarse simulation, the two processes are going to be following or going to have with high likelihood the same velocity. Okay, so that's the scheme. And now we have to, of course, see, well, how well does it work? So that's where we can do some simulations. The first thing I want to do now is just to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as which parameters we have, which we have to choose in our model. So on the one hand, we have this fine time scale epsilon squared. That's the average time between collisions. On the other hand, then we have to select a sequence of time steps for a multi-level scheme. So we have multiple levels going from 0 to L, capital L. Then we have the sequence of weights, theta, which determine how much of this coarse diffusion comes from fine diffusion and how much of it comes from fine velocities and jumps and collisions. And then to summarize, our aim in picking these parameters is going to be to bridge very large simulations where we have mostly diffusive behavior with some simulations that are accurate enough to resolve this fine time scale epsilon squared. So the level strategy we're going to apply is the following. we start off with a very large delta T0, as large as reasonable given our application. And then we pick a delta T1 that's smaller than epsilon squared, so that we immediately jump from this diffusive approximate model all the way to the kinetic equation that we want to simulate. After that, we can add further levels if we want, given that's determined by how accurate we want our simulation to be. So that's some tolerance we set, and if we do that, what we do is just a geometric sequence of refinements further down the line. In terms of these weights, this whole explanation and motivating why we need both information from both velocities and diffusion in the fine process to generate the coarse process only really applies because we want to bridge from this very coarse delta T0 to this finer delta T1 where we're simulating two different models. Once we get into this finer regime, all of these models are going to essentially be simulating the same scheme, so we don't have to really worry about this extra correlation by combining these two terms. So what we're going to do is in all levels from 2 upwards, just set theta to 1. So all the coarse diffusion comes completely from fine diffusion and is not influenced by these velocities. And at level 1, theta will take a value between 0 and 1. Again, we have a theoretical result on this, which basically it depends on all of the parameters of the simulation, what the optimal value is. Okay. So now we can simulate something. So we're just going to take a very simple quantity of interest in a 1D model. We start all the particles in the middle of a line, and then we estimate the square particle displacement at after some time t star. Epsilon in this case is 0.1, and we're going to use a Gaussian velocity distribution. Now we have a table of results here, but what I really want you to look at here is line 1. So if you look here, you see that on the one hand, first off, we have this very fine time step delta T1, which is much finer than the coarse time step delta T0. And that the simulations at level 1 have a variance which is much smaller than the variance at level 0, indicating that our correlation is good. So we have these pairs of particles, their variance is much smaller than the variance of individual particles. And then if we look at the total cost of what we have here, well, we have a simulation with a cost which is order 10 to the 9th, given a cost metric that we have defined. And we then can compare this with what it would cost to do the same simulation with a single level Monte Carlo method. Well, then we have to do this number of samples to get the variance reduction from the coarse level at the cost of doing all the samples at this level. And what does that give us? Well, 10 to the 12th. So we have a speed up of roughly a factor of 1,000 in this case, which is already quite nice. But of course, this is also just a very simple test case. So I've already mentioned that this delta T1 should be smaller than epsilon squared, which is clearly the case here, epsilon squared being 0.01. But how much smaller should it really be? Well, that's a question we asked, and we wanted to look at what the answer to that question was. So what we did is we tried a number of different level strategies. Refining this level 1 time step by 2 each time for a number of different values of epsilon. And then we checked some results, which if you're familiar with multi-level Monte Carlo literature, you'll know what it is. If not, you can just consider this to be a kind of indication of how much do we save if we refine the time step at level 1 by 2. So if this value is positive, it means that it's cheaper to reduce the time step that will save us in total simulation costs. If it's smaller, it means that we lose or the simulation becomes more expensive if we keep refining or making time step 1 smaller. And for the different values of epsilon, indeed, what we see is that the rule of thumb seems to be 2 to 3 orders of magnitude smaller than epsilon squared. That's what we see on these first 2 curves. The other 2 seem to be going in that way. At least this one we can still see some kind of downward trend. But obviously, as epsilon gets smaller, these things get quite expensive to compute, and that's why we ended up struggling with going all the way in these curves for this presentation. But hopefully, in the future, we can complete this figure more, and also look at more different ranges of epsilon parameters. So that's from a sort of theoretical perspective, looking at only level 0 and level 1. Now, what happens if we look at the total simulation costs? I'm going to now show for these same curves or the same simulations, the total simulation cost. And what we see is that for epsilon equal to 0.1, indeed, where we predicted our optimal level strategy would be, we have sort of the lowest point in the curve. It's flattened off. And these two where we expected that we would save from reducing epsilon 1 or delta t1 further. And we see that the curves are still trending downwards, so that's an indication that our work is correct. But here, the optimal level is suddenly much more, or the optimal strategy is much more expensive for a course, for a large epsilon. Now, why is that? Well, twofold. On the one hand, you see that on average, these lines don't drop so dramatically. It's maybe a factor 2 from between the worst one and the best one. So it's not like there's a huge difference here. That already indicates that we don't have to over-optimize too much in these cases. Probably rules of thumb are actually going to be quite good in most cases, and we don't have to spend too much time on this analysis for practical applications. And yeah, we have this noise, and this noise comes from the fact that in the previous analysis, we only looked at level 0 and level 1. And here we have a number of extra levels in our simulation, and these very fine levels take very few samples. So because we have very few samples, we have to estimate the variance of what the variance of these samples is, given few samples. The variance becomes noisy or poorly estimated. Because the variance is poorly estimated, the number of samples we require at the fine levels is also poorly estimated, meaning that we can easily perform too many samples at these fine levels, where also the most expensive samples take place, meaning that we do a lot of extra work which isn't necessary. So this peak you see here is more an artifact of applying classical multi-level strategies for estimating how many samples we need than anything else. But I guess the key conclusion from this graph is that what I already mentioned, we don't need to over-optimize. We just need to make sure we're in the right ballpark area in terms of level strategies. Okay. So now I want to briefly say something about some work done by colleagues of mine in our research group, Numa at KU Leuven, and then also see where the work in this area is headed in the future. So last year, a new paper came onto arXiv, authored by the fellow PhD student who's also worked with me on this topic, Bert Mortier, and then his two supervisors, Martino Balmans and Giovanni Samai. And this scheme is basically an alternative for the asymptotic-preserving scheme that I presented at the beginning of this talk. So where we had the fixed time steps, and we added this artificial diffusion to sort of stabilize the equation. Well, they take a different approach here. And what do? They also add some kind of artificial diffusion. But if you look at this picture, what you can see is on the top, we have, let's say, the true process that we're trying to simulate. And the red dots indicate collisions. Blue dots indicate that the particle is moving in a straight line in some direction. So this is just a plot in terms of time. And what their scheme does is, if there are multiple collisions in a time step, they substitute it with one collision, and then they generate a velocity for the next time step, which is needed because the velocity must change compared to this. But then instead of performing all these other collisions in between, they replace this with a normally distributed value, which is including information from what the velocity will be here to make sure that it's distributed correctly. I'm not going to go into too much details, but this is how they introduce their diffusion in this case. This has a couple of advantages compared to what I presented for our work. One, they are better. They are able to more accurately resolve exactly when these collisions happen in some way, meaning they get a better rate of convergence. So their scheme is no longer linear, but in fact 1.5. And also at a certain point, when the time steps become smaller than small enough that there are multiple time steps without collisions, they don't have to perform all these steps anymore. So what they do is at this point, an estimate is made of when is the next collision going to happen. If this time horizon is past the time step, then you don't have to perform a collision here. And if it's past the time step of multiple of these steps, then you can just skip all of these time steps and not do any diffusion at all. So whereas our scheme always has some diffusive component and has some velocity component in their scheme, when they perform very small time steps, they actually simulate the correct model completely. The results should be comparable, but they do less numerical work. The downside is the scheme itself is a bit more complex because they have to deal with some more difficult things in terms of making sure that everything still works when they take this approach, because this diffusion should look like it's a sum of a number of collisions sampled from a given distribution. But it does look very promising. And this year, two fellow PhD students, Peter Jan Robbe, has just in fact finished his PhD, together worked then on applying multi-level Monte Carlo in this setting. This is the paper describing that, which is on arXiv as we speak. And now what's left is to compare these two multi-level approaches, because obviously, probably in the area we're interested in, one of the two will outperform the other. It is possible that that this approach is going to, in fact, be the optimal approach, but we have to compare them to be sure. And then also we need to look at what actually the cost of the correlations is, because they have a correlation approach here, which is different from how we correlate things. They have more complicated expressions, which mean that perhaps the correlation becomes more expensive. And in fact, in our own work, we never really looked at the cost of performing correlations. We always use some kind of cost metric, such as how many time steps do we do in total, which is great if you want to find an implementation independent way to compare your scheme or to benchmark your scheme. It's not so great if you want to compare two different approaches which have different correlations, and also make a really fair comparison that'll be interesting to people in the application areas. So we need to look at efficient implementations of these schemes now in codes which can be used in practical cases, and properly comparing them with tests as well in terms of timings. And finally, we're going to do all this in collaboration with some people from the Department of Mechanical Engineering working on these fusion problems, so that we can really make sure that we're solving the relevant issues using these schemes. So with that, I have a few references to show. On the one hand, some background material on the two asymptotic-preserving schemes I mentioned today, and then the multi-level Monte Carlo, of course. And then these are the 4 papers covering the topics that I talked about today, with a new paper with a number of details that I sort of glossed over today to appear on arXiv soon. It's currently being iterated over the authors. So with that, I welcome any questions and look forward to hearing.